We're not going to build trust by trying to build trust. We build trust because people interact regularly with each other, and that interaction has taught them to trust one another.
Welcome to We Made This Political. I'm Laura Forcum, president of the Independent Center, consumer psychology PhD, and former marketing professor. I'm Lauren Hall. I'm professor of political science and the author of the Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. This is We Made This Political, a podcast about making politics more about flourishing and less about power. So we talk about living together in families, communities, and as citizens, drawing from our backgrounds in psychology and political science, as well as parents. So today we're super excited because we have with us Seth Kaplan. Seth is a leading expert on fragile states, social cohesion, and community resilience, a professorial lecturer at Johns Hopkins University and a senior advisor for the Institute for Integrated Transitions. Seth is the author of this really amazing book, Fragile Neighborhoods: Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time. His work focuses on how deep-rooted social breakdown fuels inequality and instability and what we can do about it neighborhood by neighborhood. And I'll also add that Seth and I are both on the advisory board for the Pro-Human Foundation. And Seth, I'm sure you're also doing a bunch of other advisory work as well. So we'll kick off with a softball, and then hopefully none of them are hard balls. But so,
No,
how did you...
no spinners, no curveballs. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had all pitches, whether they're good or not. Go ahead.
So how did you get interested in the topic of communities? And so your work started with fragile states. So you were primarily on the international scene. And then just recently with this book, I'm just going to keep flashing it at people, you moved into sort of the American space. So what triggered your initial interest in sort of fragile states? And then how did you transition over?
I would say, so that's multiple questions. So when
It is.
college, I basically was a wanderer. I think I'm still somewhat of a wanderer. So I literally wandered to lots of places. I lived in Nigeria. It was literally I was 21 and I was living in Lagos, Nigeria. And then I was in Asia for many years and I was in business. And basically at some point, that wasn't for me. And I decided, let's say around 30 years old, I asked myself, what is it that bothers me? What's the big question that I keep thinking about? And the big question really was, why do some states and societies work better than others? There was that. There was also, I think, in the fragile states, it seems odd because if you know me personally, I tend to be like, I like to live in my cave. I like to think. I'm not the most social person, but yet there was something about a hunger for warm relational environments. And so I think there was that personal desire. Fragile states are much warmer than developed countries. And big question. So some combination of what we might call intellect, some emotional or feeling, as well as thinking. And I don't think we often don't consider how these interact. But in my case, I think you could look at maybe not intentionally, but some combination of that desire to be with a certain kind of person with that big question led me to think, how do I use this work? I had read a lot. I'd already been in dozens of countries. And it was already some years after 9/11. So fragile states was a very obvious, practical way for me to apply my knowledge in a way that would be useful. And I also had this interest in people. And then some years go by and we're 2015, 2016. I live in Washington. I'm already doing all this wonderful work on fragile states. People know me as the fragile states guy in Washington. And I basically would be asked without me prompting anyone at all, like a coffee. Part of what I do is go around and meet a lot of people, one-on-ones in particular. Is the U.S. becoming a fragile state? I got asked this question. When you get asked 7 or 8 times this question, it's telling you to think about something in a different way and prompting you to do something. So my lens for how countries work has always been social, relational, social cohesion, social dynamics. If you look at my fragile states work, it's unique for this. I actually came back from Nigeria, where I was last week. And even the practical work we do is highly relational in a way that maybe other people would not approach problems the same way. So the American journey, and it was really a journey like I do in any country, it's talking to people, or getting out of the places foreigners tend to go to fancy hotels in big cities, capitals. I basically would wander, talk to people, whatever. So I did a lot of this in the United States. I organized a group, a social capital group in Washington with people like David Brooks and Yuval Levin and whatnot. And after several years of thinking about the question of how does the social dynamics affect what people are worried about, my conclusion was that it was very local. And that's the big thing that had changed. It wasn't that we worry about the bigger questions of politics, the bigger questions of polarization and trust and all that stuff. But actually, I think what really is important to see is that nationally, not a lot, maybe what we see has changed, but the processes haven't changed. If anything, there's more national organizations, institutions, more people engaged. Really, has changed is the loss of the local. Well, I would say again, thinking again, personal, intellectually, I personally, without ever having a master plan, had repeatedly in my life made choices that brought me into stronger community. I became religious. And then when I eventually moved out of New York, literally, you could say I interviewed half a dozen neighborhoods before I decided upon where I want to live. I've consistently, personally, as well as intellectually understood the relationships, at least for me, mattered. And I thought it mattered to the larger world. And community and neighborhoods is a choice that I've made, but also from the evidence I've seen has consistently been what I think is the biggest loss in our society over the last two generations.
There's so many follow-up questions I have to that, but you talked about interviewing neighborhoods as you were moving to Washington, DC, and one of the questions that I have for you is when you're thinking of a fragile neighborhood versus a more healthy or robust neighborhood, what can you tell us what those two things look like, and what were you looking for when you were interviewing neighborhoods around Washington?
Again, this wasn't a formal interview, but I did sleep in places. I knew I wanted to go south of New York, so I looked at some places in New Jersey. I looked at places around Philadelphia. I actually never thought I would get this close to Washington. I'm 10 miles, 11 miles actually from the White House in Maryland. Only a neighbor where I lived in Brooklyn recommended this place. But in terms of if you think of all neighborhoods on a continuum, fragile, flourishing, I think I would, again, you can look at these physically and you can actually physically go and walk around. But in general, if I'm studying the two types, and this is not about economic poverty or
Right.
economic wealth, I do think in the United States, there is a correlation, social poverty, economic policy, but globally, actually, the poorer places tend to be socially richer. If we understand that I go to communities in Africa, the local is strong. It's above the local that tends to be problematic. But I would say from fragile to flourishing, I'm looking at the connectiveness. I'm looking at the strength of local institutions. There's other factors that affect those, but those are the things. A place that's strongly connected with lots of place unique institutions that care about the
Mhm.
place, those are places that tend to flourish. A neighborhood where people don't connect or mistrust, and there's no what's a local institution? It could be a small business, could be a house of worship, a church, or some other house of worship, could be some civic association, could be anything civic, social, religious. It could be like a government institution that's very unique to the neighborhood and all of those things. I live in what I would say a flourishing neighborhood, and we have all types of things and just some factors that affect that. The physical makeup of the place can affect that. To some extent, the density can affect that. But I would say things that we don't really tune into too much is like schools are thought of in a very vocational manner today, but historically they had a really strong social relational role when a neighbor like my whatever my for example, my oldest, my daughter, who's going to be 13 on 2 days from today, actually. She'll be 13. And so she goes to a school, and maybe three-quarters of her classmates are walking distance away. That means she's spending time going back and forth to school with them. She she wants to go out of her house and visit them. She we don't let her walk in the nighttime, but you can go half an hour away walking.
Wow.
Yeah, but probably 25 minutes would be the max, maybe the furthest person. And you're welcome to do that. And you can wander house to house and they're nearby. So it changes the relationships to each other. It changes the relationship to the school. The principal of her school is a neighbor. I don't know exactly where he lives, but I know he's here someplace because I see him on the street. I would just say, when we think of institutions and connections, and that's your lens, it changes how you look at everything else in society.
Yeah. So one big theme is in your work is trust, and this wasn't on our list, but so there's yeah, as Laura says, there's 800 follow-up questions. When you look at neighborhoods, is there like a specific thing that you think builds trust, or like how do you think like if trust is the glue that holds communities together in some sense, like what do you look at to either measure trust, or how do you think it erodes?
Yeah.
Anyway, tell us about
So
trust.
first
About
of all,
that.
I'd say one of the biggest challenges in this work of relationships is that it's hard to
Mm,
measure. And so I see it at the country level I work at. Everybody wants to measure growth. Everybody wants to, they come up with fancy measurements on governance. Some of it is not really accurate, but at least they have numbers. Really hard to measure social cohesion in a country.
yeah.
Really hard to measure. I could tell you Afghanistan and Ukraine, I could tell you that Ukraine had much more cohesion than Afghanistan. And you can see that when certain historical moments come about, the Afghanis divide unless there's an enemy, and Ukrainians all came together to fight in a way that surprised people. So,
Mm,
what about the social dynamics in these countries that were so different? Really hard to measure it. There's some things you could look for. But in terms of your core question, so I would say you build trust, and this is what I think is really missing from the trust question. We're not going to build trust by trying to build trust. We build trust because people interact regularly with each other, and that interaction has taught them to trust one another. So, what we are losing in our society with youth, for example, if they only know the online world, and the online world is unforgiving or whatever it might
mm,
be, or had bad experiences online, where are they developing trust? And I think you have to look at, we see declining trust. First of all, the data on declining trust is much more obvious national than local. The local actually has much less of a decline in trust.
yeah.
It
Well,
tells you one thing that's really important. But another thing is, if you look at how we're spending our lives from the time we're a child into an adult versus two generations ago, think about what people are experiencing in their household. Think about what they're experiencing in terms of what they're interacting with on a daily basis. And think about their relationship to the types of institutions they have in their life. And just compare what an enormous difference every part of their life is compared to what they used to experience. It's all about that interaction with people
mhm.
at home, on the street, in whatever organizations you're engaged with. And if you're constantly being trained that no one is predictable and caring and giving and someone you can depend upon, how do you learn to trust? And I think we underestimate how that socialization process on every level has affected the way we look at our larger politics and our larger institutions in our society.
Yeah, your sort of like broader theoretical conception just now made me think of the case of Cabrini Green in Chicago. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Cabrini Green was a public housing development that the city of Chicago closed down, and they moved all of these people out of Cabrini Green into other affordable housing units around the city. And one of the things that nobody anticipated was that the people would be worse off. And I think the thinking was like, this is a very impoverished area, right? Like concentrated poverty. This isn't good. But what they missed was that despite being resource poor, there were tons of networks of people and there were really high degrees of trust and interreliance. And that's not to say that there weren't problems in Cabrini Green. There absolutely were. But there were also these relational resources that are, as you said, really hard to measure and detect unless you're actually there and part of them.
And again, it's hard if you're in a flourishing neighborhood and you just take your stool and you sit on the street where you go. One of the joys in my neighborhood is to go to the park you have to choose the right time, of course, and just watch again, you're talking about smaller kids running around wild, talking to one another, people coming and going. And it's just, and so that interaction, those relationships, that just everything, it just, you feel that people feel that they're in some common journey.
Yeah.
You feel it. You went for a walk this morning, and I saw my neighbor. Actually, the person across the street. I didn't see him near my house. I saw him 10 minutes from my house. Actually, he was going someplace, and I was going someplace, and we're talking for 2 minutes. I know where he's going today. He doesn't. He tends to go away on the weekend to some house by the shore. He's probably about 70-something-year-old guy. Him and his wife are going, but here we're interacting, we're talking just a couple of minutes, and I'm doing that so many times. Again, when I had a problem recently, I got some water coming into my house, which shouldn't have been happening. I usually would be systematic and looking for contractors, but I didn't have time. So I went across the street. Actually, I didn't go across the street. I texted him because he actually wasn't in the neighborhood that day. He gave me a person to call, another neighbor, actually a very good friend of him, who actually that's what he does for a living. And boom, within a few hours, that guy was in my backyard and inside my house trying to figure out the problem, and so on and so forth. And so I'm in again. I don't do it all the time, but I'm in a neighborhood where if I had one of my kids got hurt, it's happened a few times. We're running down the street around the corner, 3 blocks away. We know where the local doctor or whatever nurse is, and your neighborhood is full of personal, professional, technical resources that you don't even know about. For me, it's not always, but often like the default, and it just changes your whole outlook. And because
Yeah.
these people are neighbors, not all of them are the local plumber, too expensive, so I may not use them again. So they're not all perfect people, but again, we often do things for each other. And then, of course, you're going to trust people and you're going to trust the wider world more because this is your experience of life, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Incredible. I'm really interested in drivers of social innovation, and both Laura and I are bottom up thinkers, and that's like a major theme in your book. And lesson 8 in Fragile Neighborhoods, Seth's book, which you should all buy. Doing a great job promoting the books. Lesson 8 focuses on sort of government decentralization. So one thing that you know that I glommed onto immediately is that too much sort of government bureaucracy or hierarchies can often it funnels community resources away from what the community really needs. And instead they start focusing on jumping through these hoops to get access to resources. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that. And if you have examples of specific either policy shifts or organizational shifts that you think have done a good job of decentralizing power in that way and giving communities more of an opportunity to focus on their needs.
Yeah, I would say this will be a theme of my next book, which I'm in the process of writing. But I think one of the challenges we have to building strong community, strong, deep local relationships and making that the center, which I think is so important for our own personal health, our societal health, and has a lot of downstream implications for so many challenges we have, so many social, political problems. One of the challenges is that our society is now dominated by these big systems, whether we think of the corporate, but the nonprofits are all big systems. Government has become a big system. Even a lot of churches are big mega churches. And those that are good, these systems, like let's say some of the mega churches are known for trying to be very relational. And a company like Apple, it's the one company that that I know if I call, I'm going to get a person and the person's going to be personal. And most everybody else, I never want to call. I never know what I'm going to get, probably a AI, whatever thing. So I know some of these organizations lean into this, but for the most part, we are, I think, mistrust and frustration and alienation is almost the natural outcome of living in a world where we become dependent on all these big, impersonal, distant institutions and their rules. I think on the if you're poor and you depend upon a lot, just think of how your world is. I can remember when my youngest child was born and whatever they messed up at the hospital and we did not get a social security number and I could not get insurance. Boy, you should have seen my anger. I tried not to be angry, but I was going crazy with this office, that office, waiting in line. It took about 7 months before I finally figured it out in terms of I went through everything. But you're like literally going to these alienating
Yep.
offices where you're sitting there for all day. And it's, of course, and then eventually the insurance, somehow, whatever it was, it got lost between three organizations. And so imagine if this is your experience of life on a somewhat regular basis. Imagine how that affects your worldview. But I think even when things are efficient and they work, they're sometimes great. I don't want to go shopping. Well, my shopping gets delivered. I like that. But then there again, if it ever doesn't work, they brought the wrong item. There's a lot of things that when you're dependent upon these systems, you can get efficiency, you can get gains, and I don't want to say that's not great because I also use it. I do think it's great. The question is, if you only have the apps and you have a real problem in the real world, the apps are not going to be there for you. If my daughter once dropped her youngest, my son, and on the cement, and he's bleeding, and how much we were like scared. My wife took off down the street and comes back 45 minutes. He's bandaged with complete instructions from a medical person. We had an emergency, or my wife's mother had to go to the hospital. She disappeared and I needed help with my kids for a couple of days, 4 different neighbors. So all of this stuff,
Yeah.
again, even think of our own health. I would say we are most healthy when we co-create health. We're least healthy when our only answer for some health problem is to get a diagnosis and get a treatment. Yes, I go to doctors. I need diagnosis. I need shots. I need treatment. But if that's the only answer, is that just think of how many more ailments I'm going to be diagnosed with, which I think we see a lot with youth that it almost becomes trendy to have a diagnosis and a treatment. And that's not healthy. So I just think we don't realize how pervasive it becomes that we become dependent upon these big systems and their interests are not our interests.
Oh, absolutely. I think Lauren and I had a really similar conversation about this, that institutions' interests are not our interests. We talked with Veronique de about that, and that I'm teasing one that hasn't been released yet. But I think that's so important because what I hear you talking about in psychology is researched as the locus of control. And so it's interesting because I think we often see this tension as the locus of control is either external or it's internal, right? It's either totally outside of me or totally inside me. But what you're talking about is actually like this group level locus of control, which is we can solve this as a community. And I think that's really interesting. And it's almost like you're talking about honing a
So
skill.
in the ideal world, we co-own our places.
Mhm.
And it may mean that I alone can't do something. Of course, sometimes you can, but you and your neighbors come together we want to change this street. We want to change that. The thing is, it's like the idea healthy society makes us all believe that we co-own it. We have a
Mhm.
society where we feel that it only does to us. And that has explained so much of the anger at our politics and our elites and it only does to us. We have no say. We have it's like the locus of control. I think that's a really nice way of saying it has been taken away from us. And it makes us unhappy and angry.
Yeah, I think about that, Seth, with the anger that people are displaying and the violence that they display, especially in these like institutions, the places where I see signs about you need to, if you're violent, right, we're going to remove you, are places like hospitals and schools and airports, right? And if you think about those places, those are places where control has been totally stripped away, an institution is in control, and I'm not justifying violence, but I think you're right that the response to that is anger, and sometimes it's
Mhm.
expressed physically.
Yeah, I haven't seen in this country, but I do know there are countries where there is violence at medical professionals because people feel victims. We saw the shooting in New York of an insurance professional. That would be the closest I've seen in the United States. I haven't seen it on site. I know instances overseas where they're on site, but I think this is a problem that we've always had in parts of our society. Think of blacks, think of Appalachia. But I think it's become much because in those cases, those people literally they had no locus of control over a lot of decisions that affected their lives dramatically. And so they did not trust or do not trust the larger institutions and Native Americans. You can just think of lots of examples. But I do think what the challenge today is that feeling is much more pervasive. I think, especially in working class, but I do believe it certainly spread well beyond that because so much has been taken away. And I do want to differentiate between the local, we use the word institution. If an institution exists in your neighborhood, for your neighborhood, even if it's for profit, it often has, not always, but it has its interest in terms of the health of the neighborhood is tends to be aligned with the residents. Just
Mhm.
large, much more of a system that it's placeless. It doesn't care anything about your neighborhood. It only cares about transactions. So I do think we have to differentiate between transaction oriented organizations and relational place oriented organizations. I think this differentiation is often lost and we
Mhm.
don't see a difference. In fact, we think the systems are better because the systems are more efficient. But I think what we've learned is a healthy society needs both, and we've lost this balance.
Wow. We have a question in the chat, but I wanted to just mention briefly one of the themes in my work is breaking down these false binaries. And one of the false binaries I think we've created is a sort of like individualism versus sort of communitarianism, or like the individual versus the community in some way. And so in my first book, which is on the family, I talk about sort of social individualism. And it's this, I think we've missed, this really basic, and Laura's familiar with the developmental literature, but like humans are never pure individuals, right? Like the way that the human brain grows is in a social environment. It doesn't grow normally if it's not in a social environment.
It
Like
would
you
not
can't,
talk if we were all
right,
alone. There's
right.
a very occasionally you hear these instances of people who don't know how to talk because they didn't grow up in a talking environment.
Yeah. There was a wonderful Atlantic article a couple of years ago of studies that have been done about the children who grew up in Romanian orphanages. And what was really interesting about it was both the language deficits, but also the trust deficits, to get back to your point. So you learn whether other people are trustworthy by practicing, like by interacting with them. And so if
Especially
you never get
in
the chance as
I
a
think
kid,
we underestimate what happens to kids in the first 5 years of their lives.
yes. Yep. Yep, and that's such a crucial point. Okay, Daniel in the chat asks, and this is, I think, a really cool question because there's a lot of really interesting research on this. Any thoughts on the physically built environment and good design to promote healthy neighborhoods and community?
I think I live in a neighborhood that is I'm not sure it's planned that way, but it is a it's like a compact neighborhood. And so the features that it have that's really designed, the boundaries are pretty clear. We're surrounded on 3 sides by trees. In fact, you could argue we're surrounded on all sides. We have 3 rows in and out in different directions, and more or less in between that, we have green areas. It's not exactly true, but something like that. So we know the boundaries very clearly. So one is boundaries. Two is we have a center. Again, I would say a non-beautiful shopping center. I hate to use the word ugly, but maybe an ugly shopping center, but we have our center. We have our own restaurant. You have some shopping. We have a pharmacy. Again, it's nothing to write home about, but we have a center. We have the boundaries. We have a clear identity. What's the name of this neighborhood? We have diverse, we have very diverse housing options in this neighborhood. So we have multi-million dollar houses and we have pretty cheap houses. And we have at the and one edge, but part of our neighborhood, we have four apartment buildings. They're like 25 stories tall. I'm not quite sure why they're there. It all predates me. This is stuff from the 1960s. It happens to be that another side of that is a more major street. So the fact is, there are people that can get a studio apartment up to a three or four. I think it's up to three bedroom, maybe four, maybe a four-bedroom apartment. Get a relatively cheap house, or you can live on 10 minutes away and have a very expensive, very nice house. And so that heterodox housing means we have all sorts of different, I would say, different classes, different people at different stages in their lives. We have
Mm.
incredibly in my neighborhood, we have, which I've not seen in the United States very often, we have family networks in my neighborhood. So there's literally this guy I met this morning. He had four generations at some point in my neighborhood. His parents have passed away. The house next to him, they have, I believe, six different houses in the neighborhood that are related
Mhm.
sibling, his wife's sibling, his wife's parents, so forth, maybe a cousin. But the point is, so what am I talking about in terms of design? Going back, boundaries, a center, an identity. I would say mixed housing to the extent that it can be multifunctional. If you're thinking Jane Jacobs, Jane
Yeah.
was talking about stages of housing. And so that's not exactly what we have here, but we have very different types of housing, different price points. We have the retail. Probably the retail would be better if it was more in the center. We don't have like lots of sidewalks, but it's very walkable because the houses are not very far apart from each other, relatively small lots, and the streets are mostly not very trafficked except some of those major roads. So we have a lot of walkability between places. I think all of those favor a more highly connected neighborhood. And I would also say we have this, it's not exactly, we have houses of worship in the neighborhood. We have schools it's not one school and not everything is walking, but we have schools connected to the neighborhood. So when you design, the idea that you design a primary school, think of the 19 older pre-war construction, the primary schools were built in the center of neighborhoods because they played a central role. So you have the shopping, you have the schools, you have the religion. Just think of you're building not only for the neighbor, you're also building to ensure there's lots of institutions in the neighborhood.
Yeah, your description reminds me of something that Lauren and I have talked about a little bit, which is this metaphor of an English garden versus a more planned garden. Uh,
Yes.
and that like the English garden is designed with the idea that with a lot of diversity of plants and animals, you end up with this very healthy ecosystem. But I think we're often tempted to think in terms of designing and controlling and planning where you're pulling out the weeds, things are fertilized, things are trimmed, and that is not as robust. And it sounds like it differs in some other ways. Like it's hard to plan a healthy community, it sounds like, in a lot of ways.
A healthy community. That's an analogy I would definitely use. I think new urbanism is a movement that grew in opposition to the modernist view of planning after the war. And the modernist view of planning is single function. All the houses are here. The work is there. The shopping is here. And there's nothing that brings people together. And everything is built for permanence. That there's no change. There's no room for local institutions. And so I think, but the problem with new urbanism, I think new urbanism is it's half the answer. New urbanism doesn't really have a communal lens. If you ask the new urbanists, because I spent time doing this, they say you build density, you build walkability, and everything else will work out. That is not correct. You need to actually build for the institutions, build for the relationships. So new urbanism is a start. I also think new urbanism, the risk always is simply empowering planners to make a new plan. And and I see that in my county here because the county wants to adopt new urbanism principles and they have this big, whatever, 20-year plan. And so what if we have a shopping center and we have community institutions? That's not part of the plan type of thing. Whatever. So the thing
Mhm,
is, you need to actually think of the relationship between planners and government and citizens in a completely different way, more horizontal. So I believe you want people to build to the extent that that's possible, they build up incrementally evolving their neighborhood. And so
mhm,
that's part of this idea of design. It's not only that we design for the diverse plants. In my case, I would say the diverse institution. So a good neighbor has lots of different institutions, lots of different housing, lots of different possible zoning. All that stuff is very good for a neighborhood. But at the same time, you want the plants to decide how it will evolve. So, as an example, in front of my house, whatever my wife who likes to garden, she took all these, I don't know how she decided what, probably we decided what the deer would not eat, where it would be
mhm,
good enough. And so we have all these different stuff. There's no order, and but only filled like 20% of the space we had there. And now gradually some of them are the seeds are flying and they're taking root, and the garden is gradually spreading and
mhm,
it's completely without a design. And I
mhm.
think that's what a neighborhood should be like. It should gradually evolve and it needs to have the space, the rules, the opportunity. Things should not be imposed on it. You want to have open opportunity for growth because growth is good and change is not, we don't want change, we don't want something to be permanent, but it should be as much as possible driven by residents.
So this comes back to a major theme of this podcast. This is what Laura and I started with. We want to make politics more about relationships and less about power. And I've heard you speak in other contexts about that people think that if you get the politics right, there's a trickle down, right? And that sort of makes everything else work out.
That's,
And in
it's
Mhm.
backwards.
Yeah, it's absolutely backwards. But I think to get back to the neighborhood planning too, and I would love to just hear your broad thoughts on this. I think people like plans because they're to a certain degree easy, whereas getting into the weeds, like creating relationships with people, that's time intensive. It requires long commitments to the people that you live with and the neighborhoods that you live in. And it's really hard work and it's hard to scale. Whereas like creating a master plan that you can do with a couple meetings. And so I understand the impulse, but I think it's so destructive because we give all of this attention and all of these resources to top down politics. And it's hollowing out, to your point, the sort of the people that we really need to be focusing on. So I'd love to just hear more about your thoughts about top down versus bottom up politics.
I'm a person who likes balance. So you need some of both, clearly. But I would say one of the problems is that we've nationalized so many things. If we had a bigger emphasis on local politics, that would be one way to funnel some of that energy. But if you were to look at what you have the capacity to influence, if you step up and join with your neighbors and try to make change happen where you live, you are going to have a much bigger influence and much more impact, and you're going to feel much more rewarded than this idea that we are somehow going to impact national change. I
Mhm.
find that to be like not a realistic model of change for people who want to spend their time constructively. I don't find it very rewarding. And I think if you look historically in the United States, we're in an era that's a little bit like I would say the post Civil War era. Even though the war had ended and you had Reconstruction failed, you still had a lot of focus on national questions and politics. And then somehow the progressive era came late 19th century, and the progressive era was, among many things, a movement to reform locally. And a
Mhm.
lot of energy shifted attention from the national questions to how do we make the city government less corrupt? How do we make the services better? How do we make our neighborhoods better? Settlement houses and things like that. And you have in that era the formation of most of the national, I mean, they're very local based, but they're national, what we might call trans-local organizations were
Mhm.
built in that era. There's dozens of them that spread all over the country. But the key thing is the emphasis was working together to solve local problems. An enormous reform was achieved place by place. And that worked its way upward, actually, to have national change that took place over decades. But the key point was these organizations were locally rooted. They started focusing on how to organize and make change happen locally. And so for me, that's a much more constructive model than everyone screaming and yelling and fighting over like national elections and
Mhm.
national issues. And I don't find it a good use of our time. And I don't find it healthy for the country. And I think a lot of change that we want is in reach if we reach within a reasonable distance from where we are.
I love that. Yeah. It's interesting though, because I've done some, I used to teach the progressive era, and there's even that tension within the progressive era, right? Which is that you have these locally rooted activists who are doing really bottom up kind of work. But then even that message gets co-opted by national politics. You look at like Woodrow Wilson and the power of the executive, and then Teddy Roosevelt. And so this kind of, there's always this complicated tension between a national, but and I think there's something in human nature where we do look upward, like we're easily distracted by the conversations at the national level, even though those aren't the most important conversations for the kinds of lives that most of us live. And I used to talk to my students about this. Most people don't typically voting in local elections is very there's low turnout. Whereas those are the kinds of elections that you need to they actually affect you more than national elections in a lot of really important ways. And I don't know what to do about that, but that is this interesting.
So I'll say a few things. I would say the things that are most impactful locally may never need elections.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
if you look at changes over zoning or like some sort of local legislation or whatever it might be, it could be legislation or but it could be just regulation or this and that. A lot of things that happen in city and state government, it doesn't involve elections per se. There might be specific issues where it matters, but I can think of my sister. Again, she's not a neighborhoods person. She works on like criminal justice issues, reform. She works on getting people out of jail. And most of her focus, at least it evolves now, but originally most of her focus was just her state and where she could actually be the big fish in a relatively small pond and she could become the most important person in the state on this particular issue in a way that nationally, well, she becomes well known, but it's not the same thing. And a lot of the changes that she's impacting are only at the state level. And it could be, and it's not necessarily elections, it's some sort of reforms in police or what have you. Now, I would say the progressive era, I think you have to understand, you taught it, so I'm afraid to say anything because I didn't teach it, but you're talking about many decades. And Wilson, which I think is the example of overreach at the executive, especially towards the end of the war, the First World War. But that's it. I would say that when we define the progressive era, I think of that as more towards the end of it. And I
Yeah,
think going back to the 1880s, it's a lot of local and you're only getting national like a generation later, even 10
I think that's right.
generation later. So I do believe the movement at some point, again, it's like everything in life we want to balance. And so you could take that movement and say it overreached in several areas. The silver standard, whatever they were fighting for in the 1890s, which I have to say I'm not an expert on, could have been overreach and not a good choice. And how does that connect to all these other things? Different question. But I do think when you're so far in one direction, which I think we are now, movement in the other direction is only going to be good at this stage.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have about 5 minutes. I don't know if you have an extra 5 minutes, Seth, but
We can stay 10, 15 minutes, whatever you want.
oh, great. Great. So I have moving into the tangible. For example, I live in Rochester, New York, which is a deeply segregated city. We had very dramatic white flight in the 50s and 60s, in part due to some of the physical changes that the city decided to make in terms of transportation. They created this inner loop, which cut the center city off from the suburbs and all these other things. But so there's a really dramatic racial and socioeconomic divide. Do you have any thoughts on how you can create connections or build relationships in deeply segregated spaces. And I know our story is the same as Cleveland, it's the same as Binghamton. There's thousands of cities just like ours.
A lot of cities, yeah. I think it's hard to find a city in the United States that had a significant Black population at that point in time in which you don't have some, there must be some exceptions, but I'm not aware of them. So I would say there's a few things. First, I think one important thing is those Black neighborhoods are potentially the most valuable neighborhoods to the city. Again, I don't know the geography, but they are either the most or they're one, probably one of the most valuable parts of the city with the greatest potential for increased tax revenue, increased residents, attractive places to live. And so certainly one answer to your question is, and I see this, and I'm just trading email with someone this morning about a piece that I will publish on the city of Atlanta, which is probably the most neighborhood centric or at well, mayor's office of a major city. And so one thing you could certainly do, which is what they do in that city, or they're trying to do, is to take not all of these, but strategically chosen of those neighborhoods and make them very attractive places to live. And that will lead to the reverse. I think we're in a bit of a different era that if places are attractive to live with good housing, good education, good whatever commercial corridor, amenities, you're going to get people to move into those neighborhoods. And if the process is managed wisely, which I mean equitably, so we're not pushing people out, gentrifying people out, but gentrifying people in, so to speak, I think that would certainly be one answer to what we're talking about. And it probably is also essential to the future of the city. Think about how much money is wasted because that's the lowest cost infrastructure with the highest potential for growth, and it's not being utilized. So just think about that. And some of the other areas might be higher cost infrastructure, whatever. So that would be one answer. A second answer is places, it's hard to build bridging when there's no bonding. And those neighborhoods certainly do need some healthy institutions. So I've seen neighborhood quarterbacks, I've seen neighborhood anchors, I've seen neighborhood hubs. They're a bit different. But for example, a hub, which I wrote about in my chapter on Detroit, I wrote about quarterback on the chapter, and you don't have to show the book, but 4 versus chapter 8, a hub was he basically took over a a school that would have been dilapidated, that was basically not usable because they had lost population, got a 50-year lease, and brought in lots and lots of institutions. And that is both, I would say, helps bond as well as bridge. That neighborhood has had over recent years, a big fall in crime. So it's one of the safer neighborhoods in the city. And there's the surveys say it is one of the most optimistic about the future neighborhoods. And so again, hard to make causation correlation, but that's interesting. That's happened in the time period that they've operated in. And so by bringing those institutions in, again, it's a place that people can gather, people can feel good about their place, and all these institutions are providing opportunity and networks that are going to help connect people. So I would say there's that. I think you can think of other things like volunteer activities or gatherings that very intentionally. I know there's again, we're talking here a racial and class divide in parallel. So it may not be exactly the right answer. But I know in Grand Rapids, I've been in an organization that was very intentional about gatherings across divides. I'm not sure all classes were involved, but clearly it was designed to do some healing. And Grand Rapids also has 2 neighborhoods, I believe, that it's working on. It happens to have very good local philanthropy. So there is a great effort to strengthen some neighborhoods that were left behind. So I do believe you have to think of a multifaceted approach that will not only be relational, but also elevating neighborhoods so people want to be there. that people stay and then other people come in and then finding ways to bring people together. I mean, there's a lot of different pathways. I've only scratched the surface.
Yeah. I think it's a really naughty problem because it seems in these areas where you're trying to regentrify, one thing that you're talking about doing is having the city make investments to make that neighborhood richer and healthier and stronger, richer in a social capital kind of way. But I think in past years, there's been examples of cities coming in and displacing residents, especially poor or residents of neighborhoods of color for their own benefit, right? There's lots of examples of that in the South where I'm from. And so I think it's really difficult because I assume there's just really low trust around a city coming in to a neighborhood, given that there's a track record of Cabrini Green, for example. We're gonna move you out of here because this is very high value real estate, right? And so that trust problem seems like
And
a really difficult.
there's also a legacy of a lot of people coming in and saying we're going to revitalize your neighborhood and not following through, or people coming in again, think about it. If you're poor in America, your relationship with finance, your relationship with government, your relationship with so many people or so many organizations has not been positive. And even the social services, they have difficult rules. They're hard to reach. There's long waits. And maybe they help me with something I badly need, but they're not really there to empower or uplift me. But I do think our whole social service model is broken. It's
Yes.
expensive. It's focused on individuals and need rather than place and empowerment. And I think a completely different model is needed. Don't ask me how to get from here to there because there's a lot of actors that would be on the losing side of some of those changes. But our current model is far too expensive and it does help people. It does alleviate pain and suffering, but it's too expensive and not effective in what it really ought to be doing. And I think a lot of people suffer, not to mention that our whatever other systems, we are a free market country and regulation can be very problematic. But to the extent that we don't crowd in good institutions, some bad institutions often, the same thing in fragile states. If you don't crowd in good institutions, you end up with the wrong institutions.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what if you had one recommendation for a tangible thing, like one thing listeners could do today, right? What would it be?
You mean in their personal lives or as a policymaker or leader of an organization?
In their personal lives or in their personal lives as like leaders in like community organizations. So, something someone could do who doesn't have a lot of like top down power.
I think I would say personal and then maybe organizational. I'll give you two answers. So, personally, do you know your neighbors? Do you know your local organizations? Are there any gatherings? What would it take to have a gathering, a block party, a July 4th gathering, something around Thanksgiving for kids, a spring cleanup, whatever it is? What would it take to do that? And you don't have to do that alone. Can you find a few other people on your block, your neighborhood, and what can you do just to organize and get other people involved? Try to make it collaborative, try to work with others. Don't It's harder to do it by yourself than to do it with local organizations, whether they're businesses or churches or schools or whatever. But that's one thing you could certainly do. And I would say a second thing you could, in terms of the second thing, if you work on some organization, ask how relational is that organization? What is its role to its surrounding neighborhood? How could it be more relational? How could it be more stewarding? One of my favorite words is stewardship. And we as a country have forgot this idea that we need to steward our places, steward the country, but on a very practical manner, we need to steward our places. And so much of what we do today is just there's no stewardship. We aim to get ahead. And the first chance we can, we move. We aim to make a buck or whatever it is, and that's all we care about, and all we do is focus on our career. And mostly everyone, including sometimes our own kids, suffer from these choices. And I would ask, if you belong in an organization, how can that organization have a close relationship? If it's a restaurant or a coffee shop, again, it's easier if it's not a chain, if it's local. But what can it do to have a stronger ties with that neighborhood? Does that mean hosting something? Does that mean working with some local organization? Does that mean putting a bulletin board up that people can post activities? Does that mean giving 5% discount? Anyone's within 5 blocks? All these little things that encourage people to have some sense of loyalty and togetherness. And the same thing if you're a church, why is everybody driving to your building? Why aren't you encouraging being out in the neighborhood, working with people, civic association? We go on and on. I think we could look at every org. If you're a library, what's your relationship with the local neighborhoods? Why does everyone have to come to you? How about you going into the neighborhood and hosting stuff? If you're a school, let's not just think of the classroom. Could your space be used by local organizations? Could we have a closer tie with our neighborhood? What does that mean? I think everyone has a role to play, but when we think that we belong in a place with a place and we need to steward the place, it changes our whole posture, our whole mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. But it's something we've talked about a little bit as when there are high barriers to exit, when it's not tempting to just tap out, move to the next place, move to the next city and job, right? There's some real richness. And Seth, like, I know you write about this very movingly, and I'm starting to see it crop up in other places where people are just very deeply rooted to their neighborhood or the city in which they live. And I think people are coming back to that. We maybe had lost the importance of that in our hustle to do better and make more of ourselves. So I'm glad to see the renewed attention on that, like, really deep investment to where you are and where you're from.
I think our national conversations are often dominated by people with certain types of education, living in certain types of places. And if we go around our country, we would see, like in the Midwest and the South, many of these ideas are just the norm. And if you're more like the mobile elite in big cities, it's not really your norm. So it's a bit more of a foreign concept. To the
Mhm.
extent that we incorporate these other voices, and to the extent that actually most people, there's a really good British book in which it compares somewhere people to anywhere people. That's David Goodhart. And I would say many more of us are somewhere people than the anywhere people can possibly imagine. And to the extent that we build a society that encourages being somewhere and that builds to the strengths of the somewhere people, I think we as a country will be much more successful.
I love that. It's a
Mhm.
nice
Yeah, I read
distinction.
that book.
Yeah.
I had a copy in front of me. I still tell you the title, but it's a David Goodhart book from 7 or 8 years ago.
We will put that in the show notes. Anyone in the chat have any final questions for Seth? We do like to end on, feel free to type as I'm talking, but we like to end by asking guests what you're feeling optimistic or hopeful about this week. And Laura, obviously add anything if you have other questions after this. But, um, we like to end on a positive note. So what are you feeling sort of good about right now?
Well, first of all, I would love to know who was on the chat. So maybe if you have a list, you'll send me later. And I would love if anyone wants to reach out. The easiest way to do that is on LinkedIn, and you're welcome to connect and message me. But I would say, what am I hopeful about? I could say personally, I'm hopeful because my kids are about to end another year of school. And I would say it's always challenging between school and camp. So I'm not sure I'm so hopeful about that gap thing because that's a lot of work. But I would say it's a miracle to watch your kids grow up and to see every day these living things get older and just to see them. So I'm always hopeful when I see my kids and I see what they're always. I could say that personally. When I look at the wider, like the country, I would say I'm most hopeful because I see more of this local the local civil society coming out. Like I often feel we need to build civil society 3.0. 1.0 was the Tocqueville, 2.0 was the progressive era we talked about. Progressive, de Tocqueville was mostly towns, not very big cities, a lot of urbanization, industrialization, and mass immigration, late 19th century, got much bigger cities. Then you have the progressive era, which peaks in roughly 1964, according to the data, and then it goes down. And I believe we need a third version of our civil society. And I see so many interesting things happening. Again, it's green shoots, it's embryonic, it hasn't covered lots of places. And I would say we do have that biggest headwinds is that too much of our society is built for these larger entities. And to some extent, I don't want to say strangle because it's not intentional, but they take up a lot of resources and energy in a way that makes it harder for these smaller entities, these newer entities to grow. And a
Mhm.
good garden needs to have a change. But I'm just hopeful because I see a lot of those organizations. I wish I knew them all, but there's certainly dozens of them that I see, and many of them get traction and become more significant. And they have different models, more contemporary models, and different ways of using technology and different ways of interacting with people. And I think that's the future. And we need to spend a lot more time identifying them, investing in them, talking about them, and the faster they grow, the better our future will be. But I'm hopeful because I do see a lot of them.
I'm gonna piggyback on that for my optimism, which is, I hate to plug my own work, but my work on healthcare focuses on how systems in the healthcare space have really centralized and corporatized healthcare, particularly as that affects birth and death. And one of the more hopeful things that I'm seeing is that technology is actually allowing us to recreate some of the systems, like doctors doing home visits or nurses doing home visits. Like we've actually been able to, because of the efficiency and the reduction in transaction costs that certain kinds of technology have allowed, we actually can facilitate some of those hyper local spaces that we've totally lost. And I think you're seeing this in people rebuilding local clinics and really rethinking how we provide healthcare. Because right now, to your point, like healthcare is just deeply alienating for most people, right? You go to some nameless,
Yeah,
faceless doctor.
model is not the right model. Yes,
Mhm.
we need technological. It's great innovation in the space. I think that's a good thing. But it's this idea that everything is a problem and we have a medicine for you. Boy, is this the wrong thing. Every time
Mhm.
someone says, "Does your kid have so and?" I say, "I don't care. I don't want to know about it." I'm like, I don't want a diagnosis here. We all have something. So what? Who cares? Move on. If it's a serious problem, I want to see a doctor. But for the most part, I don't want a diagnosis. And if the doctor wants me to do something, I'm like, do I really need to do that? And I want to be very skeptical. But the whole thing is, I would like to see. In fact, I have a piece on this that I have to just finish about the co-creation of health and
Mhm.
what would happen if we focused on co-creating health neighborhood by neighborhood as opposed to diagnosing and remedy health? And that would be different incentives for healthcare providers. One of the big problems is that no one owns a space, no one owns a place. They're all focused on individuals and their own thing. What would happen if you had a healthcare company in this neighborhood, everyone in the neighborhood, they were responsible for the health? I mean, that what would that mean in terms of how they acted? They would act very differently, wouldn't they? They'd be spending money to nurture your co-creation of health or catalyzing your co-creation of health instead of just waiting for you to show up with or even advertising, you have this problem, you have that problem, encouraging you to think you have a problem. And every time you show up, you do have a problem. That's
Right.
to be honest. It's a recipe for mental illness to be and depression.
Yeah. Yeah. Through lack of agency. Absolutely. So I've been thinking about this as we talked about communities and neighborhoods. I'm just struck by a new sense of appreciation for my community. So I live in a very small town, and I think it's doing a really good job of balancing this sense of which there's a lot of tradition, there's a lot of established people and older buildings that have been retained, but there's also room for growth, and there's new buildings and new businesses coming in. There's a neighborhood around the corner. is being built. An old textile mill is being repurposed into new lofts and offices. And it's really cool because it's small enough that people are really deeply engaged in renewing this place in the kind of way that Seth talked about. And so I feel like we lucked into this posture of being able to have growth, but also have some permanence and make room for new people and new families and businesses and ideas in a way that's just really special. Yesterday, I walked to the post office. I walked to see my neighbor who had some flowers for me to take to my yard. I walked to the butcher and picked up my community share agriculture box. And I feel like it's actually like this tremendous luxury that I have in this neighborhood. And it's luxury that you can't buy, right? It's this incredible set of resources, and they're not costly resources, but they are very difficult to attain. This conversation's given me a new appreciation for
It's
that.
much or everyone is going to move to your neighborhood.
I know. Message me. I'll tell you where we are.
All
Yeah.
down. So by default, you have everything is very local. So
Mhm.
that is not many people have that advantage. But I do think in this world, more people will seek it out, given that they have just a certain class of people who can make that choice. But it's very livable to live where you are compared
Mhm.
to being in a city you have to commute or all anything else like that.
Yep. Yeah. I just wanted to mention Mark dropped the name of that book, The Road to Somewhere
Yep.
is the book. It sounds like that's a good one to stick in your cart or buy from your local bookstore. Actually, that's a better idea. Thank you so much, Seth. Typically, Laura and I, we record this and we clean it up and it'll be posted on Monday mornings. So if you want to keep up with this or listen to this again, you should subscribe to We Made This Political, which there should be an opportunity to do that in the chat or somewhere. I don't know how we're going to do that. But anyway, look for us on Substack. Seth, any last words of wisdom before we log off?
That's a heck question. Words of wisdom. Was
Mhm.
just say the next time you're inclined to not say hello to that person in the house next to you, resist it, go over and say hello and try to find the try to even if it's for 2 minutes, just ask them how they're doing today or something like that. I happen to live in a neighborhood where that's the norm actually. So it's really easy for me that
Mhm.
people walk up to me sometimes and I'm trying to think of where did I meet this person and they're asking me something and how do they know that? And it's just, I'm just a little bit lost given the fact that I'm in my cave sometimes, but it's just the norm that it's just a joy to live in a place where you walk around and you actually know who's behind the doors and you know that somebody has your back if you need it and you want to help people, it just changes your whole posture. So I would just say my words of wisdom would be find a way to know someone on your street. I would say join a local organization. I'm on the board of one and I'm involved with a second. And I would say make a difference where you can, and you can make a big difference with people near to where you live.
Awesome. Love that.
Thank you both, and thank you for advancing the conversation.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Seth.
thanks.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend. Bye bye. Cheers.
Hi, everyone. This is Lauren jumping back in to remind everyone to check out Seth's book, Fragile Neighborhoods. And you can also find more of Seth's work at sethkaplan.org. We also want to take a quick second to just remind you to please, if you like this podcast, to rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast platform you choose. It really, really helps the algorithm find us and helps more listeners find us as well. And please, if you like what you're hearing, share. And of course, you can find Laura and I on Substack anytime. So connect there as well. I hope everyone has a great week and talk to you all soon. Bye.